A bunch of novellas in one big chunker. This is my May wrap-up. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome and welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Licton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today is my wrap-up for the month of May. More specifically, it's a wrap-up of what I've read in the back half of May. I already had a mid-month check-in that went over the first half of the month. I have to tell you, this is the third time I'm recording this video. The first two times, it just was so rambly and all over the place. And the reason is, I had to teach this weekend, and I had about 14 hours worth of travel, maybe a little more, spaced over the span of 2 days. And after all that, I thought I would be in a fit state to do a video, and it turns out I wasn't. So I had a good sleep, and hopefully third time's the charm. So let's see. Now, before I get into what I read the last half of the month, I did want to say that in 1 month, is my 1-year anniversary on BookTube. And so I would love your help. I would love your suggestions about what I should do to celebrate this milestone. I know there is an anniversary book tag, a 1-year anniversary book tag, so I could do that. I don't think I have enough subscribers to actually do an AMA. I think if I put out a call for questions, I wouldn't really get enough for a full video. But I'd love your ideas, your suggestions. Let me know what you think I should do to celebrate this milestone. You can let me know down in the comments, or you can find my email address in the description. Send me an email. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how I can celebrate my 1-year anniversary on BookTube, which is coming up in the beginning of July. Now, with that said, let's get to the books I read in the back half of May. Though I will say, if you watch my last wrap-up, I had this feeling going into that wrap-up at the middle of the month that my reading month wasn't going very good. And the reason for that, I think, is because I had a really ambitious TBR for the month of May, and it didn't feel like I was making a dent in it. And part of the reason for that is these days, about half the books I read are audiobooks, and I get them from the library. And so there's a little bit of chaos thrown into my reading schedule because I'm at the whims of what books are available when. And whenever you get a book, you only have 2 weeks to read it. And you can renew it if no one else is requesting it. But if someone else has requested that book, then you're not able to renew it. So you kind of have to read them when they come in. And so because of that, my planned TBR kind of went out the window. And so I had this experience that my reading month wasn't going very good. But then as I prepared for that video, I realized I'd read quite a lot, just not the things I had been planning on reading. And that showed me how much my perception of my reading affects my experience of my reading, if that makes sense. And so I'm happy to say that didn't happen again the back half of the month. I had no expectations. I kept a very wide open mind. And I didn't read as much the back half as I did the first half, but I had a really good 2 weeks. And, not all the books I loved even, yet because I had no expectations for what my reading month was going to be, I had a really good time, and that made my reading much freer. And so I enjoyed the last 2 weeks of reading, even though not all the books were my favorite. So let's get into those actual books. I finished 10 titles in the back half of May, though one of those is a collection of essays, one is a collection of short stories, and then 4 of them are novellas, and then 4 novels. One of those novels being a big chunker, a 900-pager. So let's go through all of them. Not necessarily in the order I read them, but in an order that makes sense for me to talk about them. The first thing I want to talk about is a collection of essays. This is called To Save and Destroy, Writing as an Other. And this is by Viet Thanh Nguyen. He is the author of The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2016, I believe. He also wrote The Committed, which is like the follow-up to The Sympathizer. And this is a series of essays he gave at Harvard. It is the Norton Lecture Series. The Norton Lectures are these kind of esteemed lecture series that's been going on since the 1920s. And it's for the performing arts, essentially. I think it's the chair is called the Norton Professor of Poetry or something like this, but it's a very expansive idea of poetry, and it's all about performance. Other people have given this lecture series include Toni Morrison, Umberto Eco, Leonard Bernstein, John Cage, Herbie Hancock, so a number of different artists, both performing arts and literary arts like this. And so he was asked to give this series of lectures. So it's 6 lectures, and I listened to the audiobook. It's performed by the author, and these were great. I'm actually thinking of doing a full review just of this book, but I want to get a copy of it first because I want to reread it. It's the kind of book I want to read. I want to underline things. I want to highlight. I want to really think about what he said, and I didn't have the opportunity to do that with an audiobook. I will say this book is being published, or was published rather, by Harvard University Press, and so it's quite expensive, even though it's quite a slim book, and I doubt it'll ever come out in paperback because university presses very rarely do that. So I'm going to try to get a copy of the ebook, and that way maybe I can collect my thoughts a little better. But in this collection of lectures, some of it is a little bit memoir, so you get to know more about him as an author and as an artist, how he grew up, where he came from, and what influenced his perception of art and his perception of writing. And the main idea that goes through all 6 of these, as it says in the subtitle, writing as an other. So what does it mean to be an other? So obviously he is a refugee and he is Asian American, and so he's a minority, but that's not the only type of othering that he looks at. He goes so far as to say being an other to yourself. What does it mean to be someone who came to America as a refugee, but is now part of the middle class / elite class? And there's something about betraying who you are as a person when you are writing for someone else. Like, who is your audience that you're writing for or creating art for? Is it for yourself? Is it for where you came from? Is it for a different audience? So he explores the idea of othering in many different capacities, both othering within yourself and othering that's forced upon you from the outside. And he has questions about whether this othering, if it makes you stronger or weaker, can it be a superpower, or is it always a detriment? How can it affect your ability to create art in the world, and how can it affect your ability to be in conversation with other people? It's really, really wonderful collection of essays, so I highly recommend it. I'm going to try to get a copy of it and maybe do a full review where I can collect my thoughts a little bit better. But I will say the audiobook is very nice to listen to, and I imagine it's a very similar experience to actually attending the lectures that he gave. So I do recommend the audiobook as well, but for me, it's the kind of thing I want to dig into a little more and really spend more time thinking about some of his ideas that he brings up. Now let's talk about the collection of short stories I read. This is a collection of short stories by Ramsey Campbell called Scared Stiff, Tales of Sex and Death. And so it's a collection of 7 short horror stories. And you can see it's quite a small book. And they're classified as short stories. I think really they're more like novelettes, like right in that 10,000 to 15,000 word range. And these were great. This was published in the late 80s, but 5 of the stories had been written in the late 70s. And at the time, in British writing especially, and in British horror, the idea of including sexually explicit content on the page was forbidden, right? So he was reacting against that. But the important thing about this book is that none of the sex in this book is sexy, if that makes sense. None of it is titillating. None of it is tawdry. It is used to create this ambience, to create an atmosphere, and to tell you something about the characters. And it goes a long way to doing that. I got this book a few months ago at a used bookstore when I was traveling, just because I saw it, I thought it looked good, and it's been sitting on my shelf since then. But recently, earlier in the month, Cliff from Cliff Dark Gems happened to do a review of the same book. So I said, well, I should read it then. It was inspiring, so I am appreciative of his inspiration. And I'd say it's a really great collection. Like, there's only 7 stories here. Of the 7, I think 5 are really good, and the other 2 are just okay. They aren't fast-paced stories at all. They're very kind of slow and meditative. They really built up tension. They're looking at ideas of control, of violence, of perception, of what it means to be in a relationship, what it means to prioritize yourself over the other when you're in a relationship, what it means to give in to your desires, even if your desires are unspeakable. So it's a really fun collection of stories, and you can tell that he is reacting against what is expected of him as a horror writer. And he mentions, and Clive Barker wrote the introduction, at least to my copy, and they talk about the fact that as horror writers, you're trying to explore the human condition, right? That's what you're exploiting when you write a horror novel, the human experience. And sexuality is part of that human experience. So using sexuality with explicit sexual content as a way to build up your experience of a horror novel or a horror story is a natural progression of the exploitation of human emotion to affect some sort of feeling, right? Which is the goal of any good writing. So I thought it was a really smart collection. I enjoyed it. It is of its time insofar as it feels like horror written in the 70s. So if you are looking for something that is a little more modern, a little more kind of punchy, then that's not here. This is slow, meditative, contemplative horror that also has a few graphic scenes that are more disturbing than anything else. Now moving on to the novellas that I read. So as I mentioned, I read 4 novellas this month. The first one is Straight by Chuck Tingle. Now, Chuck Tingle is known for his queer absurdist erotica that he was self-publishing for many years. And he has started writing, I guess, traditional literature, if you want to call it that. And he's written 2 novels so far. He has a 3rd one coming out later in the year. His first one, so they're both queer horror novels, so that's how they are marketed. The first one is called Camp Damascus, which I loved. I thought it was really good. Kind of YA horror, kind of a little bit new adult horror. I really enjoyed it. The next one is called Bury Your Gaze, which I thought was really funny, and it was a dark satire. I didn't really feel like it was a horror novel, which is fine, but it was marketed that way, so I was a little disappointed. But the writing itself and the story itself was great. Now, Straight is a novella that he wrote before either of those 2, and this is great. It's a reread for me. I'd read it a while ago, but I saw a chance to listen to an audiobook version, so I read that, and the audiobook version was great. The premise of this is there's some sort of cosmic event that has happened, and for one day, all of the cisgendered straight people in the world become mindless zombies who are bent on nothing but violence and attacking and murdering queer people. And that is the whole premise. And when the story starts, we're following our main character, and it's the 3rd year of this event happening. The first year it happened out of nowhere. No one knew what was going on. So there was a lot of loss in the queer community. There's a lot of trauma that they're still trying to overcome. People had to, fight off their family members who went crazy and tried to murder them. And so there's grief and loss. And then for the second time it happened, 1 year later, they were somewhat prepared for it. There's a vaccine, and it wasn't as bad. Now, this is the 3rd year, and it's the eve of this event happening. So our main character and 3 of his friends are going out to Joshua Tree, out to the middle of the desert. They have a cabin that they rented, and their plan is just to hunker down and hide away from everyone and just survive the night, right? And that is the whole plan. And of course, it doesn't work. People know where they are, and they are hunted by crazy straight people who go insane and become mindless zombies. And it is a lot of fun. It walks that line between camp and terror really well. So there are a few moments that are very hilarious and campy, but overall, it's very sincere. Right, and that is why it comes off as campy, I think, is because it's very sincere, but the terror is real. The violence is real. There are a few scenes of really graphic violence, not a lot. It doesn't pervade the novella, but there are a few of them, and they're really effective. The pacing is really effective. Everything about it is a great novella. I highly recommend it if the idea sounds amusing to you. In the end, like I said, it's very sincere. It's looking at the ideas of family, found family, what it means to protect yourself and to protect people you care about. Especially because this is at the time, at the anniversary of the third anniversary of this thing happening. There is a vaccine, but there's also a lot of vaccine hesitancy, and there are a lot of people that refuse to take the vaccine, and there are a lot of people that don't care about protecting others. And because it's straight people that need to take the vaccine, but they have to take it so they don't hurt queer people. So a lot of them have no interest in it because they don't care about the other. They only care about themselves. And so at this point in our current society, ideas of vaccine hesitancy and what does it mean to take care of others by either taking a vaccine or doing some sort of work on yourself so you are helping others that you may not have any connection to is a very relatable topic at the moment. But in any case, it's a great novella. I really highly recommend it. It was a lot of fun. Next, I read the novella I Can Fix Her by Ray Wilde, and I actually already did a full review of this on my channel, so I won't talk about it too much here, but it is a short novella about a woman named Johnny who sees her ex at a cafe, and she wants to get back with her ex. And she feels that her ex is irresponsible, but her ex, Alice, can be fixed, right? Like the two of them can fix themselves so they can love each other the way they're supposed to. So there's a level of codependency there. So she goes back to Alice's apartment and things start getting weird, let's say. The story takes place over the span of a week. And for instance, the second day, when she wakes up the next day, she realizes that Alice's dog is a different breed than it was the day before. And little things like that keep happening. The story is told with this fever logic, this nightmare dream logic, where things don't make linear sense. And everything is constantly shifting and moving. And what it's doing is taking the interior experience of a toxic relationship, toxic on both sides of these two people, taking the inner experience and putting it outward, making it exterior. So it's a really fun little read. The writing is really tight and really smart. I really enjoyed it. At one point, the narrator is trying to communicate with the characters in the book, in the story. So there's this really interesting tension in the way it's written, that the narrator sometimes is this third person omniscient narrator, but sometimes is actually actively communicating or trying to communicate with the characters in the story. So it breaks all sorts of fourth walls, and it's a lot of fun. I definitely recommend it, and you can check out my full review if that sounds interesting to you. But it's about relationships and about what do you need to know about yourself and what kind of work do you have to do for yourself in order to be fully present for another? And is it possible to be in a healthy relationship with someone else if you don't really know who you are or what you want in this life? And those are the questions it's playing with. The next novella I want to talk about is by Ursula K. Le Guin, and this is The Word for World is Forest. And this is a really fun novella. It's not subtle. It's about colonization and about the ego, especially the male ego, I think. And it takes place on a planet. It's part of her Hamish cycle. It takes place on a distant planet that humans from Earth have colonized. And they are planning to colonize this planet and exploit it for basically its trees and for its lumber and like this. That's the whole plan, is to basically strip mine this planet. But there are beings that live on this planet, and the humans just assume that these beings are not much smarter than animals. That's how they treat them, and that's how they relate to them. But you find out that they are highly intelligent. They just have a way of being in the world that's different than what humans from Earth are used to. And so the lack of understanding each other is at the core of this. And yet the humans from Earth, especially one of the character point of view who we follow, embody this idea of not just capitalism and colonialism, but also kind of misogyny and chauvinism, and the idea that, might makes right, that because I'm able to overpower you in a way that makes sense to me, therefore I deserve to dominate you. And so there's nothing subtle about this at all. It's very overt. And what is more powerful? What is a more powerful way to be in the world? Is it the way that the humans are doing, that's nothing but destruction and exploitation? Or is it the way of the characters on this planet already, who have a much different way of existing? We could say more peaceful, but it's also just different, right? And it's a really wonderful story, and it is very clearly about what does it mean to consume things that don't belong to you? What does it mean to overpower others? What happens when the way you perceive the world and the way others perceive the world is wildly different, and those two things clash? Is there a way to reconcile and live in community with others whose ways of understanding existence are so wildly different than your own? So this is a fun little story. The writing, as always, by Ursula K. Le Guin is really strong, really direct, almost poetic, but it never ever feels like it gets out of line. And it is a novella, so it's really brief, it's really short. I listened to the audiobook of this and it was only a few hours long. If you enjoy, contemplative, speculative fiction, then I definitely recommend this. And you don't have to be aware of any of the other work that she's done. This, the Haymitch cycle is has a couple of different novellas and short stories, but they're all independent, just set in the same world. So you don't have to be familiar with any of those just to pick this up. If you want just a little bit of a glimpse into the psychology that she's looking at, and with the xenopsychology of these beings on this planet, the name, where the title of the book comes from, we think of the word Earth, often referred to as Terra as well as a planet, but it also is referring to the dirt, to the ground, right? That's what Earth is referring to. Here, the word they use to refer to their planet is the same word for tree or forest. So the whole way of thinking about their existence with the planet and with the ecosphere is different than humans. So part of the psychology that is being explored has to do with an ecology of being one with your habitat, basically. So again, I do definitely recommend this. And then the last novella that I want to talk about is by Mira Grant, and this is called In the Shadow of Spindrift House. And this is like a dark fairy tale mixed with a haunted house story with a little bit of eldritch horror thrown in at the end. I loved this. I thought it was great. The premise is that our main character, Harlow, her parents were murdered when she was very, very young by a cult, and she was taken in by her grandparents, who had no interest in raising another kid. They basically neglected her. And when she started high school, I think her grandfather died, and her grandmother was like, I'm piecing out and going to a retirement community. You got to figure your shit out. And her best friend's mother ended up adopting her. And so she ended up living with her best friend. So she has always been an outsider ever since her parents died. She's, the weird kid who has the murdered parents. Yet another group of kids take a liking to her because they want to solve mysteries. And there's a mystery and they need her intelligence to help them solve it. And they become like a little Scooby-Doo gang. And everyone looks at them. The whole town thinks they're adorable. These 10, 11-year-old kids that are solving mysteries. And it becomes a big part of her identity, solving mysteries and engaging in the supernatural, whether it is supernatural or not, but engaging in it in such a way to solve mysteries. And that it keeps them together as a group. Now, flash forward, they are on the cusp of adulthood, and the gang is breaking up, and they're all going their separate ways. Yet her whole identity is tied into what it means to be part of this group of friends. And so she is desperate. And she proposes one big last job, which is Spindrift House, which is a house in Maine that there is contested ownership of it. And so anyone that can go into the house and find proof in the house of who the actual owner is, regardless of who that is, they can find irrefutable proof, then they'll get $3.5 million. So she gets the gang back together to go for this one last job. And as you can imagine, it doesn't go as planned. Now, the other important thing to know, which you find out right in the beginning, is that her family has a connection to this house. That's how she found out about this house in the first place. She was researching her parents. So there's something that is actually pulling her towards this house on the Maine coastline. And it's this really atmospheric, moody story. As always, Mira Grant does great with characters. I really enjoyed spending time with all of these 4 characters. They feel complete. They feel unique. They feel like people that you can relate to. And the story itself is well-paced, and the writing is strong. And if anything, I would have loved for this to be a full-length novel. It was so fast-paced, and it worked for a novella. But I would have loved to spend more time in every section of this story. In the beginning, when the group is kind of breaking up and going their own way, and there's that desperation, you could have wallowed in that for so many more chapters. And then there's like the road trip section where they're traveling from the middle of the country over to the East Coast, and there are a few little mishaps or experiences at a part of their road trip that is a lot of fun. And then when they get to the house, there are a few moments that are really unsettling, and I think there could have been a lot more of those if she wanted to expand it into a novel. So I would have loved for this to be a novel That's how much I enjoyed it. But as a novella, it's very fast paced. It's very inviting. It pulls you in right away. And I highly recommend it. If you like a little bit of eldritch horror, a little bit of haunted house, and a whole lot of kind of emotion about what it means to be part of a found family, what it means to know who you are, what it means to inherit something from your parents or from your ancestors that you don't know what to do with, and that is becoming an obstacle for you forming relationships in this life, then those are all the things that she explores in this. It's very heartwarming in that way, and just a little bit creepy. Okay, those are the novellas I read. So now I read 4 novels as well. So let's get into those. The first one that I finished is The Book That Held Her Heart by Mark Lawrence. This is the final book in the library trilogy. And I have to say, I was disappointed by this. I really loved the first 2 books in the trilogy, The Book That Wouldn't Burn and The Book That Broke the World. And this one, it just didn't do it for me. I really wish it did. I liked the ending. I liked where he went with it, but the first 3/4 of the book were nothing to do with any of the ideas he'd set up in the first 2 books. The first 2 books have a lot of ideas about knowledge and about the importance of knowledge. The library, this mystical kind of liminal library that exists throughout all time and space, is a repository for knowledge. And there's a question of if knowledge has to be earned or if it can be given. And if there's a difference in how that knowledge will be used depending on how it's received. Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe humanity is destined to be filled with xenophobia and protectionism and violence no matter how they receive knowledge. So there's all these questions about knowledge and about how you relate to the other and how that knowledge can either serve as a bridge for you to connect to others, or it can serve as, a border wall essentially and create obstacles. So there are lots of interesting ideas here. And he gets back to those at the end of the novel, and where he goes with it is very smart. It has a strong emotional resonance. It has a lot to think about, but the first 3/4 of this book just don't go there. And that would have been fine with me. Introducing new ideas is no big problem. It gives you just more to chew on, more to think about. But what frustrated me is that it felt like he was taking shortcuts throughout this book by bringing the characters. He painted himself into narrative corners that were interesting, and you wanted to see how the characters got out of it. And then he just, over and over again, it felt like the story was taking the easiest, shortest, almost laziest route. For example, there are a bunch of characters that end up in a part of the library that you haven't seen before. And it's like this liminal zone, and it's really interesting. And as soon as they get there, they have to figure out a way out, right? And right away, this is an interesting space. You want to spend time there. And there's one brief moment where you learn a little bit about this liminal space. But then, instead of them figuring out what to do, another character just shows up randomly. This is a character that is from a previous book. And this character is like, oh, I know where we are. Just follow me. I'll help us out. And then they follow this character and they get out of this interesting place. And then the character says, oh, I know you're looking for your friends. I know where they are. Follow me. I'll bring you to your friends. And then as they're going to their friends to meet up with their other group, they meet up with some antagonists, another group of people that they've been fighting with. And they are about to have this big, brawl and murder each other. And then this character they met says, don't worry, I have a spell that says no one can engage in violence when they're in my presence. And so instead of fighting, these 2 groups have to talk to each other. And now, meanwhile, they're all starving because they've been locked in this library for however long. And then this character says, oh, don't worry, I have another spell where I can create food out of thin air, basically. And they create enough food to feed everyone. And then they say, oh, you need to go somewhere? Well, I can create a magic portal and send you wherever you need to go. And so that's just so boring. Like, that is not interesting, right? The characters don't have to do anything. There's no struggle on the part of the characters. Everything gets handed to them. And that's just one scene, but over and over and over again, the characters just have things handed to them. Or there are coincidences that they right away, literally, they like hand wave away coincidences, and they just say, oh, the library wanted it this way. It's not a coincidence. It's what the library wanted. And it just didn't do anything for me. So I wish I liked it more. I've watched a bunch of reviews and everyone else seems to love it. So I am the odd man out. I wanted to love it. I wanted to listen to other people's reviews and have them change my mind, and it just hasn't happened. So I'd been planning to do a review of this whole trilogy because I loved the first book, and then I liked the second book even more than the first book. But now that I have had such a disappointment with this third book, I don't know if I'm going to do a review of the trilogy or not, so I still have to think about it and think if there is anything interesting I can add to a review that won't just be me complaining about the way it ended. So we'll see. The next novel I read is The Haunting of Room 904 by Erica T. Worth, and this was okay. This wasn't great. This has to do, our main character is a paranormal investigator. She can see ghosts, but she hasn't always been able to. Originally, her sister could see ghosts, and no one believed her sister, and her sister had a drug abuse problem, and her sister got involved with a cult or a cultish group that had to do with the occult. But then her sister took her own life a couple years ago. And when she did that, her powers moved on to our main character. So now all of a sudden, our main character realizes her sister wasn't crazy. and can see ghosts and is using that to like make a living off of it. She finds out in the course of the story that maybe what happened to her sister wasn't what it seemed like. Maybe she didn't really take her own life. Maybe there were other forces at work. So she's trying to solve that mystery. I'll say this, the writing in this is really strong. I think the writing is clear and descriptive and really inviting. I think the characters are great. There's great inclusion. Our main character is Indigenous American. There's great Indigenous representation, minority representation. There's great queer representation. So the story and the characters are really interesting in that way. And the characters feel real. They feel fleshed out. They feel genuine. They don't feel like they are just like, fitting in roles. But the story has too much. Like there are too many separate storylines, and they all come together, I suppose, but none of them are given the time they deserve because they're all rather interesting. But since there are so many of them, there's no real opportunity for even any red herrings. It's more just like, here's a piece, hold on to that. Here's another piece, hold on to that. Here's another piece, hold on to that. Okay, now they all fit together. And so there's just like no chance to ruminate in any of these interesting storylines because there are so many of them being put together that you don't get to spend time with any of them the way I wanted to. The pacing was really fast paced, and that was part of it. They didn't take time to linger on any of these stories. So the pacing was good. The writing itself was good. I just thought it was overstuffed. But it wasn't a bad book. I enjoyed reading it, and I do recommend it if you like kind of creepy occult books and books that have to do with family and with curses and that have, good representation. What I did really like about this is that our main character looks at the supernatural and at ghosts and at demons and the occult, not only using a Christian lens, but recognizing that different religious traditions and different spiritual traditions have different ways of navigating supernatural entities. And sometimes Christian methods will work, but other times she has to rely on methods that come from her ancestors that are part of the indigenous community, or sometimes she has to rely on methods like from her ancestors from Mexico because she also has family from Mexico, and other times she has to rely on friends who have understandings of supernatural and spiritual practices from Africa and so forth. So she says that, there isn't one way to solve some of these problems. And so I appreciate that because, one of the problems with all these possession stories or exorcism stories is that they focus just on the Catholic idea of demons and exorcisms, is as if that were the only culture and community and religious tradition that has an idea of the supernatural. So I did appreciate that. I just think that overall, it felt overstuffed. Like it could have trimmed out some of its storylines and paid more attention to what was left and been a more robust and fulfilling book as a result. Then the next book I want to talk about is Ship of Destiny by Robin Howe. This is the final book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy. I loved this. I thought it was great. This was my chunker of the month. This was 900 pages. Each of the books in this trilogy are 900 pages long. So it's a long trilogy. And the books don't have any definitive ending until the third book. So the first book and the second book both just end in the middle of these storylines. So you have to be committed to read almost 3,000 pages if you want to get the whole story. The whole story is following essentially one trader family, and they all go their different ways, and the chapters each follow a different perspective. It is a second world fantasy book, so it's very similar to our own, but slightly different. And this is the second series in the Realm of the Elderling series by Robin Howe. So the Realm of the Elderling is a 16-book series, but that's splitting up into 5 distinct story arcs. And so this is the second story arc, these 3 books, and I loved it. I thought it was great. I think actually it may be better than the Farseer trilogy, which is the trilogy that opens up the Realm of the Elderlings series. So I'm going to do a full review on this trilogy, so you can look out for that coming up in the future. I won't speak more about it now, except that I really enjoyed it, and I think it was worth every page. I didn't think it was slow moving. I thought it was really well paced, and all the storylines were interesting, and the way a lot of them ended forced me to think about my reactions to characters and what I expect from characters and what I expect from ideas of justice and what I value in terms of character progression and also story progression. So it challenged me in that way and was really exciting. So I did have a good time with this. And then the last book I want to talk about is Never Flinch. This is the new book by Stephen King. It is the 4th book, or the 4th standalone book featuring Holly Gibney, who of course was introduced in the Bill Hodges detective trilogy. And as Stephen King was writing that trilogy, he realized how much he loved Holly Gibney. So then he wrote The Outsider and If It Bleeds, and then Holly, and now Never Flinch. And it was fine. I'm going to do a full review of it because it's a Stephen King book, so of course I have to do a full review. But I'll say it was fine. I didn't have high expectations going into it. And the reason I didn't have high expectations is because I think Holly Gibney does best as a character when she's facing non-human antagonists. And if it's just, a serial killer or crazy people, then it's not nearly as interesting because Holly as a character she's so good at deductive reasoning, and she's always been coded almost as possibly neurodivergent. King doesn't use that language, but the way he describes her and the way he describes her inner life feels like she's coded as neurodivergent. And so she sees the world in very specific ways. And to have that specificity go up against something that isn't human, that you can't understand because it isn't like anything you've experienced before, is exciting. And that makes her a more dynamic character. When she's just going against humans who happen to be, a little wackadoodle, then that's not as interesting to me. And I knew that this story was going to do that because he already talked about what the plot points were. So I knew she was just going up against a serial killer. And so, a human serial killer, I should say. So I didn't have high expectations going in. And it met my mediocre expectations. I thought the writing was very typical Stephen King. It was very much a page turner. As soon as you started reading it, I didn't want to put it down, even though it didn't wow me. It was very compulsive reading. It did do great character work, which is what King is really good at, and it did expand Holly Gibney's inner life in meaningful ways. So I appreciate that. She developed as a character, and some of the ancillary characters, those in her orbit, they got some good page time and they got some character development as well. So I appreciated it. It was very much kind of late career Stephen King novel. It was a compulsive read. It wasn't what I wanted it to be. Is that my fault or the book's fault? I don't know. I will do a full review of it though, probably coming up later in the week, and so I will talk more about it then. And that's it. Those are the 10 titles that I finished in the back half of May. I'd love to know if you have any thoughts about any of them. Have you read any of them? Do you look forward to reading any of them? Do you have any suggestions for books that are similar to it? All of that you can share down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Right now, I am reading 2 books. The first one is The White Plague by Frank Herbert, because I had wanted to read some non-Dune Frank Herbert, and this is fine. I'm about halfway done with it. It's a big book. I'm not enjoying it, but it feels a little rambly. But so hopefully I will finish it soon, and we'll see if my opinion of it improves. I'm not disliking it, but I'm not wowed by it either. The other book I'm reading right now is an audiobook, and this is the 3rd book in the Emily Wilde series. This is Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales by Heather Fawcett. First book, I think, is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and the second book is Emily Wilde's Maps of the Other Worlds, or Other Lands, something like this. And these are really fun. These are really fun fantasy novels set around, the early 1900s, but in England or in Western Europe, where fairies exist, basically. And she's a scholar who researches fairies. And in this book, the 3rd book, I won't say too much because it'll spoil some of what happens in the other books, but she's interacting with a fairy court, right, in this book. And this series is it's not a cozy series. There is violence on the page, but it's not graphic, it's not extreme, and it's almost whimsical in the way it presents violence. So it's this interesting combination of whimsy and peril. And I think that Heather Fawcett has managed to find that balance really well. They're not, like I said, they're not cozy, but they're close to cozy. The violence on the page, it doesn't feel graphic, and it doesn't feel overwhelming. And there's a little bit of romance on the page as well, but not too spicy. Anything spicy kind of happens off page because the book is written as a series of journal entries. And so when anything is written as a series of journal entries, the main character is going to survive long enough to write this journal entry. So that provides a level of safety. And it also censors what she puts into her journal and what she shares. So because of that, it's pretty safe to read in that way. So it isn't spicy, but it isn't cozy. It finds a real wonderful balance between whimsy and peril. And I don't know why I started reading this series. It isn't something I would normally pick up, but I had picked it up and I really enjoyed it. And I've enjoyed all 3 books in the series. So I'll probably be done with this in the very, very beginning of June. And I'll have more to say once that's wrapped up. And that's it. What am I looking forward to in the month of June? I have a buddy read coming up. I'm going to be reading The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm reading that with Carl, and I've already read that once, but it was quite a few years ago, so I'm excited to reread that. I'm also going to be reading The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell. That's a buddy read with Alex from Alex Unabridged. I haven't read that before, so I'm looking forward to that. And then I plan on reading Children of Memory by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is the last book in the Children of Time trilogy, though now he has announced a 4th book, Children of Strife, that's coming out in March of 2026. But this is the last book of the original trilogy. So earlier in the month, I read Children of Ruin, which was the 2nd book. So I'm really looking forward to reading that. And then I have a couple of arcs, an arc by Andrew Joseph White called You Are Meant to Be Human. That's going to be coming out, I think, in August or October, maybe. And so I'm going to be reading that, I think, also because June is Pride Month. So I'm going to be trying to read more queer books. So You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White. I'm hoping to read The Emperor of Gladness, which is Ocean Wong's new book, hoping to read that. And then I have arcs for books by Haley Piper and C.G. Drews, which I'm also hoping to read in celebration of Pride Month. They don't come out until September or October, but I'm going to try to read them in June. And of course, June is June on the Range reading event where people are encouraged to read Westerns, and I'm probably going to read some more splatter Westerns. The splatter Western series is put out by Deadhead Press, I think, and most of them are novellas. There are some novels, and I've read maybe a half dozen, a few more, and I got really into them last year, but then I just got distracted. I have almost all of them. I think there's a little more than 24 books in the series so far. And some of them are great, some of them are not so good. They're written by different authors and they're all independent from each other. So I'm going to pick up a few of those and try to read those this month as well. But that's it. Those are my only plans. It's very loose, very disorganized. We're going to see what comes in from the library, what audiobooks come in, and that is going to affect my reading and my plans as well. And that's all I have for you. I had a really good May. I read some really good books in the first half and the second half. A few of them were also really good. And a few, were just okay. And that's fine. I had a great time reading them, even if they weren't books that were going to change my life. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. How did your May go? Did you read any particularly exciting or interesting books? Have you read any of the books I've talked about? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, any of that down in the comments below. And as I mentioned right at the top, if you have any ideas or suggestions about what I could be doing to celebrate my 1-year anniversary on BookTube, please let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that down below in the comments as well. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.